Hello everyone. In this short video, I'm going to be discussing about the basics of Active Directory services. So the agenda for this session is going to be, I will start off with the basic topic, which is what is an Active Directory service? And you have something called objects within Active Directory. I'm going to be talking a bit about Active Directory objects and also the advantages of using Active Directory. Why should you use Active Directory? And where all can it be used? Let's get started. So Active Directory is a technology that has information about all the objects, in the sense users, computers, resources like printers, shared files, folders in an organization's network. To make things more simple, you can even think of Active Directory something similar to a telephone directory. So this technology basically is used to arrange and store information and then provide access permissions based on those information that is already stored. The core concept of Active Directory is to bring everything together. When I say everything, I'm referring to the objects in your Active Directory infrastructure, to mention a few: users, computers, contacts, and few other objects. There are two main functionalities of an Active Directory service. The first functionality is to authenticate, and the second functionality is to authorize a security principal or an object within an Active Directory infrastructure. So if a user has to access a specific resource within an organization, there are two steps. The first step is to validate a user's identity, that's the authentication part, and after the validation is a success, the user is allowed to access certain stuff within the organization. The user is restricted access to certain other stuff within an Active Directory infrastructure. So all that is part of authorization. So the definition of an object can be, an object is a physical entity of a network, and it can be described by a subset of attributes. And I'm going to share with you some of the common attributes, some of the common objects that you would see in Active Directory. You have forest, you have domain, organizational unit, and then you have the user object, group, contact, computer, shared folder, printer, site, and subnet. For instance, if you have a user account John in Active Directory, the user object John is defined by a certain set of attributes. All these objects together, all these attributes together, forms the definition for the object in Active Directory. And there's a special type of object in Active Directory called the container object. As the name indicates, this object can contain other objects within itself. So a container object can have users, printers, computer objects, and few other objects as well. And there are another type of objects in Active Directory which are called as the leaf objects. So the leaf object, unlike the container object, cannot contain anything within themselves. So these are pretty much like standalone objects. And then you have security principal objects. Objects that can authenticate and authorize. Excuse me. So you have all these types of objects. So basically the security principal object has two main parts. The first part of a security principal object is going to be the GUID, and the second part is going to be SID. So GUID is going to be a 128-bit globally unique identifier, and the SID is going to be the security identifier for each security principal object. So for example, a user object within Active Directory is a security principal object because a user object has these two parts, GUID and SID. Let's talk about some of the classifications in Active Directory. The top level classification is what we call as the Active Directory forest. So it is the highest level of security boundary. You can also call an Active Directory forest as a complete Active Directory instance. An Active Directory forest contains other domains within itself. It has information about users, computers, printers, and other network resources. So talking about information and data exchange, this can only happen between objects inside a forest. If you'd like to communicate or if you'd like to access resources belonging to a different forest, you need to have something called Active Directory trusts. So I'll be talking about trusts in the later part of the video. A forest can contain one or more domains or a combination of domains or domain trees. Trees are going to be another type of classifications. So basically, we have three stages of classification, I would say. The first level or the topmost level is going to be the forest, and then you have domain trees, and then you have domains. So the schema or the design of an Active Directory infrastructure is going to be consistent throughout the forest. Since forest is going to be the highest level of boundary, to overcome the issue of consistency, the schema is going to be common throughout an Active Directory forest. And that is applicable to the domain trees and also the domains within that forest. Let's have a look at another classification, which is domain. A domain is going to be a logical grouping of objects within Active Directory, and we have already discussed about some of the primary objects like users, computers, groups, shared folders, and contacts. And this is also the administrative boundary for objects. And the number one advantage of going with an Active Directory domain is you can have unlimited number of objects. So this can be deployed in an organization that has 50 employees or 500,000 employees. And also, the objects need not be in the same physical location. You can have a site in California, and another site in London, and another site in India, and another one in Australia. And all these sites can still be the part of a same domain. So that's another advantage of having an Active Directory service. When you have a domain, you need something that could control the domain, and that is called as domain controller. So a domain controller is the domain's supreme authority, and this is responsible for authenticating objects and also authorization. So any additions, any modifications or deletions that you perform within your organization will be passed through an object called as domain controller, will be passed through an entity called as domain controller when it comes to Active Directory. So for instance, if a user has access to a domain, the user can log on from any computer in that domain. If you have 50,000 computers in your office, you can log into your Active Directory infrastructure from any of those computers, because the domain controller will be taking care of the authentication and the authorization part. The permissions, policies, and rights can all be set for objects at the domain level or even at the individual object level. This is another set of classification. As I said, the base level would be the domain, and then you have a combination of domains which we can call as domain trees, and when you have a combination of domain trees, we call it a forest. So the relationship of a domain tree can be a parent-child relationship or a nested domain relationship. Say for instance, abc.com is going to be the parent domain. x.abc.com will be the child domain of abc.com. And when you talk about establishing communication between those two domains, that's when you have something called trusts. And there are various levels of trusts. So you have transitive, non-transitive, one-way, and two-way trusts between domains. By default, all the domains in a forest are connected by transitive trusts. and all domains in a domain tree share a contiguous namespace. To summarize, a domain is going to be a hierarchical structure of containers and other objects. So it has a unique domain name. This can also be seen as a security mechanism to perform two basic functions, authentication and authorization to domain's resources. And policies that show how functionality is allowed or restricted for users and computers in a domain can all be defined when you have an Active Directory domain in place. Next, let's have a look at something called organizational unit within Active Directory. Organizational units are terms that can only appear inside a domain. Again, this is going to be used for denoting a specific department. This can be used to denote a specific geographical location if an organization is split across multiple countries. So it can be used to denote a location, team, function, or any other boundary, logical boundary that you'd like to create. OUs are unique inside a domain. So if you have an OU named HR within your Active Directory infrastructure, there cannot be another OU with the same name. So these are similar to container objects, right? So they have other objects within them. They can contain other objects within them, like users, groups, contacts, computers, printers, shared folders, etc. And OUs can have other OUs within them, and those two OUs can have a parent-child relationship. So any permission that is applicable for the parent will also be inherited by the child by default. You can explicitly deny the permissions, deny the inheritance if that is required as well. You have something called group policy settings that allow or restrict a user's activity within an Active Directory infrastructure. Now, all those settings can be set at the OU level to make things much more uniform. And if you'd like to delegate certain administrative actions to other users in your Active Directory infrastructure, you can do it through an OU. Say, for instance, if you want your help desk technician to be resetting password for the users belonging to the users OU, you can delegate the administrative control to a specific user, so the user will be able to reset password for users belonging to this specific OU. And now let's have a look at the objects in Active Directory infrastructure in detail. And first we'll be having a look at the user object. So a user object in Active Directory is a member or part of the infrastructure, part of the organization. And a user object will have a unique identity in the domain. And since Active Directory follows authentication and authorization, based on the authorization, the user object will be allowed to access certain resources within the domain, or all the resources in the domain. And that's what we mean by authorization-based access. So if you are a user, you will be able to access a certain resource within your Active Directory infrastructure. If you are an administrator, you will be able to access almost all the resources within your Active Directory infrastructure. So all that is based on authorization. And every user object has a unique security identifier and is also secured by a password. And the second type of object that we are going to be discussing is the computer object in Active Directory. So the computer objects can be individual computers, workstations, servers, which are part of a network. Similar to the user object, each computer has a unique computer account. And that computer account allows each computer to be authenticated and authorized for access to domain and domain resources. So a server could be a domain controller or global catalog server, or a member server. And then another type of object is going to be the contact objects within Active Directory. So this object is going to be a bit different from the other two objects that we just saw. So any individual who's not part of the organization but related to the organization is going to be named as a contact within Active Directory. For example, you have vendors who would like to be part of your organization, but at the same time, they do not need access to resources within your organization. In such cases, you create something called as contact objects within Active Directory. A contact cannot log on or access the domain or network, and this cannot be assigned permissions or authorization or any type of restrictions. So users and contacts are two different objects within Active Directory. I want you to get that point straight. And then we have something called groups. These are going to be very crucial. So groups can contain users, computers, and few other objects within them. So we call them the members of the group. Instead of assigning permissions on individual users, permission management becomes much more easier when you assign permission to a group and you simply add the users to that specific group. There are two types of groups, broad classifications. The first is going to be security groups, which is used for assigning permissions, and the second one is going to be mail groups. And we have something called scope in Active Directory, and there are three basic classifications when it comes to group scopes. You have the domain local group. So to give access to resources in the same domain as the group, users can be from different domains. So that's the basic function of a domain local group, right? So then you have something called as global group. So this is basically used to give access to resources that are in different domains to users from a specific domain. And then you have the universal group. So these types of group are used to give access to resources located in different domains to a group of users from different domains. All right. So these are the three basic types of group scopes that we have in Active Directory. Now the whole idea of these groups is to grant access to resources, and the level of access and the reach depends on the type of scope that you define to that group. So why should we even use Active Directory? What are the advantages? To mention some of the advantages right here. So the first one is it is highly secure. As I said, the first step is authentication and the next step is authorization. Now that we have these two stages, we can call it a multi-layered system that's going to allow users the access to resources within your network. And another important factor that is, we are talking about centralized administration. So instead of managing objects manually, we can manage them from a centralized location. And scalability. So this technology can be deployed in an organization with 100 employees or organizations that spread across the globe with 100,000 employees. And deploying this technology is going to be easy and efficient. And at the same time, locating an object within an Active Directory infrastructure is going to be very easy using the search mechanism that this technology provides. Centralized storage, this is something that we have discussed already. And this Active Directory technology is no longer a standalone technology. So this serves as a platform for other services like your Office 365, SharePoint, Skype for Business, Exchange Online, and all of the stuffs. And when you have Active Directory, there is a concept called as profiles within Active Directory. So you have two types of profiles, individual profiles and mandatory profiles. So users can have the same environmental settings immaterial of which computer or location they log on from. So you have 100,000 computers in your network, and every time you log into a specific computer, you get the same wallpaper, you get the same settings, you are allowed to access the same resources. All those are mapped to something called your user profile. And then you have something called mandatory profile. So this mandatory profile is basically going to decide what you can or cannot access after you have logged into your Active Directory infrastructure. So individual profiles and mandatory profiles. And then now that you have users performing actions within Active Directory, you need to have a track of all the actions that they're performing. So an action can result in two types of events: an accident or a threat. If it's an accident, you need to take measures to prevent it next time. If it's a threat, you need to avoid it from happening the next time, or you need to be notified immediately. For these two reasons, you need to actually audit the changes that take place in your Active Directory infrastructure. So Active Directory is also a platform for security auditing. So this basically records the events in the security logs of the event viewer, and then you get to know what's going on in your organization. So where can Active Directory be used? Any organization that has a network setup, organizations which require 24/7 uptime, any organization where the number of users, computers, or resources will keep changing, any organization where data security is vital, and any organization that is spread across the globe. For all these categories, Active Directory would be the best fit. So, some of the sectors that take advantage of Active Directory: the government sector, corporates, schools, research organizations, hospitals, non-government organizations, and a lot more. So the advantages of using Active Directory: secure, easy to deploy, effective, scalable, flexible in terms of mergers and acquisitions, efficient. So this technology is going to be a cost-effective management system to control all the objects and other resources in an organization or a network. So if you'd like to know more about managing an Active Directory infrastructure, managing the objects within an Active Directory infrastructure, the site that you need to watch out for is www.admanagerplus.com, or you can simply shoot out an email to support@admanagerplus.com. Thank you.